It has come to my attention that somebody from a group called Real Atheology, named Ben Bavar, Beaver? His name doesn't matter. But he's posted something against my legacy and against somebody who's written in my defense. And I, on this feast day, January 28th, 2019, have decided to come back and make one appearance here to wreck Ben Bavar with facts and logic. Now, this dispute between Ben Bavar and myself contains three primary articles. The first are questions on potency. The second, questions on infinite regress. And finally, there are questions on primary being. Due to time constraints and the principle that one should never sacrifice the morning for the sake of the evening, tonight we will only be addressing the disputes on potency and the dispute on infinite regress, and save tomorrow for our dispute on primary being, in which I will provide arguments and refutations against Bavar's position to the point where he will be crying like the snowflake that he is. He's not. He's actually a good guy. Great video, too. He's really trying hard. And I admire him for that. And I want to invite him to further dialogue, because, as the philosopher says, the truth is best found when we enter into dialogue with those who disagree with us, as will be the case in the discussion of potency, which begins henceforth. Now, the first article addresses the question of whether the principle no potential is reduced to actuality except by something else in actuality. Is this a sound principle of metaphysics and reason? Ben's first argument, which I've reorganized and hopefully strengthened, is this. It seems not, because the principle itself rests on a confusion regarding the ontological status of potencies. Even though a potential may remain unactualized, a potential must nevertheless be a real thing, for otherwise it wouldn't have any impact on the way things operate in the real world. For example, the baby has a potential to cry if you take away its pacifier, and this is an actual disposition present in the baby. Objection number 2. Further, an unactualized potential is still an actual thing, as, again, is evidenced by its impact on the real world. Potencies can therefore bring about other potencies, bring other potencies to act by virtue of the former potency's actuality. Consequently, the principle described in the thesis does not hold. On the contrary, as Julie Andrews sings, "Nothing comes from nothing and nothing ever will." Therefore, no potency can give rise to act by the work of another potency, but every reduction of potency to act must be effected by something else already in act. Now I answer that. The doctrine of act and potency received its first sustained treatment in the works of the philosopher, in order to explain the reality of motion in the world. Aristotle's method placed him directly in dialogue with the pre-Socratic philosophers. Some of these pre-Socratic philosophers asserted that only being exists, and in making such a claim, they rendered all change impossible, because everything which we call change reduces to a movement from univocal sameness to univocal sameness. Everything is being, and if everything is being and there's no principle of distinction between them, then it turns out that there is no motion, and that all change is merely an illusion. On the other hand, other pre-Socratics argued against change, because they asserted that any change means a new being coming from non-being. But as the principle noted in the on the contrary states, nothing comes from nothing and nothing ever will. And so it's per se impossible for anyone to assert that nothing can give rise to anything. It is manifestly obvious, however, that change is a real feature in our world, and this is what Aristotle actually operates on. And he sought to present us an argument or a way of describing reality as it presents itself to us, rather than denying it and asserting our own fallacious reasoning over the reality of the world that is ever present to us. And so in order to do this, in order to account for change, he posited three principles. First is the principle of change itself, and another is the principle of actuality, and there's a third principle of the substrate. And in any change, you have a substrate existing in a particular way, moving from that particular way of existing to another way of existing. And now, within the two principles of one of change and one of reality, you have the principle of potency, which is the principle of change in a thing because it is the being that is yet to be, and you have the principle of actuality, which is a description of the way things really are. Excuse me for one moment. Now, and again, the substrate of a change is that which remains the same in the midst of change. For instance, I'm going to wrap this up here again. A tree that grows remains the same tree despite its increase in quantity. Now, turning our attention to the matter at hand, potency exists as a principle of being yet to become present in something which is already a being as it exists in reality, which would be an already existing substance or substrate. Now, potency cannot exist on its own, simply because on its own it's nothing. Because if something were to be purely being yet to become, then it would have no being and consequently cannot exist. Now, in contrast to potency, Aristotle identified the principle of actuality, which in all cases is some kind of present reality. Everything in reality, therefore, exists either as a composition of potency and act, or it exists as pure actuality. Now, given that there is no third option here, the only possible means by which a potency suffers a reduction of from potency to actuality is if something in reality, that is something in act, affects that reduction. Therefore, the axiom that no potential is reduced to actuality except by something else in actuality holds true. And second, we call a potency a thing. We can call a potency a thing, but only by way of reference to its role as a limit of a thing's actuality or nature. Just as the end of a line exists, but never exists apart from the line, so too a potency exists as a limit upon the degree of actuality in whatever being that potency inheres. And third, taking potency to be a thing in a sense univocal to substance necessitates Ben's position to be that of Locke or Hume, who take on a bundle theory of substance. But the problem for this is that that's not something that St. Thomas actually holds, and B, it leads to some inscrutable difficulties, such as the denial of a common substrate as a subject to change, at least in the case of Hume and philosophers following in his tradition of understanding substance. Now, reply to objection 1. Ben is entirely justified when he refers to potency as a thing, but it appears that he takes thing in reference to potency to have a univocal meaning to thing in reference to a subsisting existent or a substance. This, however, is false for two reasons. First, we can call potency a thing by way of its reference to its role as a limit of the thing's actuality or nature, which we already mentioned. And now, just again, as the end of the line exists, but never apart from the line, so too potency exists as a limit upon the actuality of thing, or the degree of actuality in things that they inhere. And one thing that's important to note about this is that if it were the case, as mentioned actually in Ben's objection, that potency were not a real thing somehow, but only in an analogical sense, then they couldn't have an actual effect in the world. If there was no principle of limit, which we call potency, in a tree, then we would have every reason to believe or to expect that tree could do anything that we could reason, could get up and walk, could compose symphonies. But the fact of the matter is that trees can't do that. And so in reality, potencies exist, but they don't exist as a thing per se. They don't exist as a thing like a substance, and cannot exist apart from some actually existing thing. And to use or to reiterate Ben's own position, his own example of the baby, is that when the baby is happy, he is in the act of being a happy baby. The baby's potential for crying, cooing, gurgling, or being upset does not exist in virtue of itself, but only in virtue of its baby nature. the baby only changes from happy baby to sad baby when something else that is actual reduces the baby's potential for sadness to actuality, such as when a parent removes a pacifier. And now when the baby is sucking the pacifier, his desire to suckle is sated, is actually sated. But when the pacifier is removed, the desire is rekindled and the baby expresses his dissatisfaction at the removal of his pacifier or his need for suckling by crying. And so the potency for the baby to cry is actualized by the removal of the pacifier, which actualized the baby's need to suckle or his desire to suckle, which then actualized dissatisfaction and reactualized that desire to suckle, which again the baby could only communicate through crying. So he cries because the parent pulled the pacifier right out of his mouth. But from these and other arguments that could be presented, it can be seen that the principle that whatever's no potential is reduced to actuality except by something else already in actuality. And now Ben does note, I'm not sure if he notes this actually, that a thing can be reduced from potency to act if that thing is an act according to several modes. The first mode that's most obvious is the formal mode. So a thing can be formally the cause of something, or can formally bring about an act present in a substance, bring a potency to act if that same actuality is present in the cause in a formal way, meaning that it exists in a univocal manner, such as when a match lights a pile of papers on fire. Fire actually exists. The form of fire actually exists in the match head. And then when the match comes over to the paper, it actually transfers in reality that same form of heat and same form of fire. A second way that something in actuality can bring another thing, a potency to act, is by way of transcendence. Or by eminence, such as when, for instance, the sun, when magnified through a magnifying glass and then focused onto a particular point, brings about a fire in that same pile of paper, or burns a hole in a piece of wood. The fire that's present, the heat that's present in the sun, is just massively more powerful, more obvious, and more more powerful than what you're going to find in a regular fire here on Earth. And so, even though the form of fire, in the same way that that's going to exist in the paper, does not exist in the sun can nevertheless act as a cause for the fires, or for the paper being on fire, or moving from the potency to be on fire to actually being on fire. And a third way is by virtue. And now one example of this is by if you take, keeping with the fire here, you take a 9-volt battery and you take some steel wool and you put the steel wool in the 9-volt battery. Even though the 9-volt battery is neither formally nor eminently hotter than or hot like fire, it still nevertheless has the potency, or has the actual active potency, meaning the power to produce fire. It, by virtue of its the electrical charge that it holds, it can still transfer enough energy to bring about a spark or a flame within the steel wool, or something else that's similarly flammable and receptive to that form of fire that the 9-volt battery has the potential to give to the flammable object. And so in each case, we still nonetheless see that whenever there's a potency, it can only be reduced to actuality if that thing is already actual somehow, whether formally actual in the same way, or eminently actual, or it's virtually actual. It has a virtual power to bring about a particular effect. Now, the second contention is that on infinite regress, which Ben denies. And he denies this in 2 objections. His first objection is, even in a per se hierarchically causal ordered series, everything reduced from potency to actuality rests on some higher member in the series. But since the actualization of no member of the series is left unaccounted for, there is no need or justification to posit a member which serves as a first and unactualized actualizer. Second objection. Actually, this is my second objection, but Ben refers to it, sort of hints at it, but he doesn't pull in Kant, which is always a good thing to do if you're trying to argue against natural philosophy or metaphysics. Now, Kant says that the arguments for and against infinite regress are perpetually locked in a stalemate, as philosophers who have made strong arguments for both positions and have strong refutations for both positions. But given the inconclusive and unproductive nature of this debate, it's best to hold an agnostic position regarding whether an infinite regress is actually possible. Hence, this is one of Kant's antinomies that he talks about in the Critique of Pure Reason or in the Prolegomena. And on the contrary, as Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange says, a series of relative and contingent beings per se, even if it were without a temporal beginning, i.e. eternal, can no more result in an absolutely necessary being than could a limitless number of idiots result in an intelligent being. Or, as he says earlier, to dispense with the necessity of a source is the same as saying that a watch can run without a spring, provided it has an infinite number of wheels, or that a paintbrush can paint all by itself, provided it has a very long handle. From these examples, it is easy to intuit that Ben's assertion of the possibility of an infinite regress of contingent things is absurd. Therefore, every causal chain, ordered per se, must terminate in a first uncaused cause, or first unmoved mover. Now, in order to further illustrate the truth that every hierarchical causal chain must terminate in a first uncaused cause, we have to endeavor to offer two additional examples. One can never have enough chocolate bunnies, which is true. But one can also never have enough chocolate bunnies so that together they are sufficient to make a real bunny. And now this holds true even if there were an infinite number of chocolate bunnies. I mean, how many chocolate bunnies are you going to use? You're going to pile together 15 chocolate bunnies and suddenly going to become your favorite rabbit, Fluffy, which would be terribly unfortunate because while Fluffy is indeed edible, and from what I hear, kind of delicious. I've never had rabbit myself. Anybody have any recommended rabbit recipes? I don't know. But my wife, on the other hand, would be terribly upset if I somehow magically transmuted the 15 chocolate bunnies that we had into a real bunny. And this would be for a number of reasons. And since it's the case that my wife would be mad at me if I transmuted chocolate into flesh, therefore Ben's position is absurd. No, just totally tangent. That's fine. That's totally fine. Nothing wrong with the tangent. But the fact of the matter is that you cannot add chocolate bunnies together to get a real bunny. It's impossible. And this is illustrating an underlying point, which I'll address momentarily here. Now, further, you can imagine yourself having come upon a series of moving boxcars, all of which, in principle, can only move themselves, do not move themselves, and can only receive their motion from a boxcar higher up the chain of boxcars. Now, question for you. So these boxcars, which, again, cannot move themselves, but rely on a boxcar that is previous to them or prior to them, if you add them together, will you ever get an explanation for the motion in the series of boxcars? Will 50 boxcars added together produce motion? Of course not. Will 100, 1,000, 10,000? No. An infinite number of boxcars? No. Just as there's no reason to suppose that adding any number of boxcars to the series would account for the motion of the series as a whole. And it's the same way, again, just as with what we said with the bunnies. There's no reason to suppose that even an infinite number of boxcars would result in the effect of a moving train. Now, the principle in play in both examples, although the examples differ in what they are, is nothing other than the law of non-contradiction as mediated through the principle of sufficient reason or the principle of causality. Now, if chocolate bunnies produced a real bunny in some fanciful universe, then they would really only be exercising a power that's properly only belonging to real bunnies. But if that were the case, then chocolate bunny would at one and the same time be a chocolate bunny and a non-chocolate bunny, which is a flat contradiction. In the same way, even if there were an infinite number of boxcars that somehow produced motion when taken together, then it would be the case that this amalgam, this collection of boxcars, would at one and the same time transmute or change all of these boxcars into non-boxcars, because again, one of the essential definitions of boxcar that we mentioned before is that they simply cannot move on themselves and they only receive their motion from a prior member in the series. And in the same way, when we have a series of contingent things, or even things which are necessary, but they're necessary through another, as St. Thomas talks about in the third way, this can't go on to infinity. And the reason for this is exactly what we've just said, because it would require that contingent things would somehow, when added together, become a non-contingent thing, or explain the very notion of existence, or the very motion present in the series itself. Now, what I think is also justified in saying, or justified in saying that the proposal of an infinite series commits a category error, in which that person argues for the possibility of effecting a qualitative change through successive quantitative addition of a contrary quality. An example of what I mean by this is that no matter how much white paint one uses to paint a house, you'll never be able to paint that house black with white paint. In the same way, no matter how many contingent things that you add together, you will never be able to, through that successive addition, account for the motion or the existence of the series, or even the whole of the series that we're trying to account for. It leaves the matter unexplained. Now, whether this series under consideration is that of movers, causes, or beings necessary through another, the only possibility for the existence of the series itself must be, and can only be, something which is qualitatively transcendent and other than the members of the series themselves. Just like the train engine it contains its own principle of motion in itself, and is also a non-boxcar, so too is the first mover, something that is entirely unmoved, therefore something that is not a movable thing, but it also must be something that is not moved by another, but moves other things, which is exactly the conclusion that the first mover argument tries to get to. And to deny these principles that I've just outlined above, actually it ends up, Ben would actually end up denying the first principle of reason, the principle of non-contradiction, because he'd be saying that that things would be A and not A in the same way at the same time. And he'd also violate the principle of sufficient causality, or sufficient reason, by saying a thing can produce effects that are beyond its own nature through its own power. Now, reply to objection 1. Now, this objection comes from Bertrand Russell. But what Bertrand Russell does not realize is that his solution only accounts for the motion or existence of every individual member of the series when bracketed off from the series as a whole, but not for the motion or existence present in and throughout the series itself. Now, as shown above, Russell here commits a category error and violates the principle of non-contradiction for the reasons I already explained. After all, no matter how many contingent things coalesce together, that grouping cannot equal something absolutely necessary, nor can it account for existence in a necessary way. It can only account for existence in a contingent way. But if we were to posit existence only being a contingent thing, and contingent thing obviously being something that's reliant on another, then nothing would be here at all, which is absurd, because I exist at the very least. I don't know about you guys, but I exist, and I know that I exist. It's very, very present to my reality. It's something I simply cannot deny. Not to resort to the Cartesian cogito, but the very fact of the matter is, I know that I exist. But given that this is the case, that I exist, you exist, we exist, the things of our being, of our world exist, but all in a contingent way, there must again be a necessary first necessary thing, which is absolutely necessary within itself, or something, if we pull it back to motion, something which moves other, but itself is unmoved. In reply to objection 2, well, the reply to this one was obvious. Kant sucks. Kant is horrible, terrible writer. He tries really hard. He's relatively smart, but he misses a few things here. And one of the things that he misses in this objection is that he does not properly distinguish between per accidens series and per se series. And finally, Kant's argument that there is a stalemate of whether an infinite series per se or an infinite series is possible, or if it's impossible and therefore must terminate in a first mover, has been destroyed by the previous arguments. It's very clear that denying or that asserting an infinite series per se is something that is impossible and violates law of non-contradiction and the law of causality. Now, from these two things, I think that we've covered, a good chunk of some of Ben's replies. But one of my problems here, and this is a personal style as well, is that me going on this long diatribe or this long monologue about Ben's arguments or any other principle is, number one, very confusing to me because I have the worst ADHD in the world, and trying to organize my mind all at the same time is very, very difficult. Secondly, there's always the risk of not being able to actually understand and articulate your interlocutor's position, which is what I'd rather do. I'm here to seek the truth. I'm here to help Ben know the truth as far as I have at least come to understand it, and for both of us to grow in that regard. And so first of all, I want to invite Ben into a dialogue next time he has some problem with some of Thomas's arguments and some of his positions, so that way I can understand what's going on and kind of ferret out the real objection, which, to tell you the truth, was the hardest part of this whole thing. And the only preparation I actually really put into it was trying to figure out what the heck Ben was actually saying and how to articulate it or understand it in a way that I can reply in a relevant way from Thomistic principles. And so I want to invite Ben to an actual discussion where we have a back and forth and it's a real conversation. Secondly, I want to invite Ben to move away from analytic philosophy. And the reason for that is this. Analytic philosophy tries to clarify the world, but the reality of the world is that it's scary and confusing. And the only way to understand the world is by accepting the fact that it is scary and confusing. And some of his analytic bent is evident in the way that he seems to argue and demand univocity. And there's a number of ways, and I think I see this in his videos and many in the writings that I've read on Facebook. But I think that if Ben wants to start pursuing St. Thomas Aquinas, he's going to have to let go of some of his analytic presuppositions, like how philosophy can be divided between an analytic camp and a continental camp, and empty his cup, because St. Thomas is very clear. He orders philosophy very, very well, but he accepts the fact that the world isn't always going to fit into our categories that we hold, that we can, through which we try to understand the world around us. All right, and that, my 3 listeners, is all there is to this. God bless.